Hey, everybody,
Hello.
and welcome to Coffee Class with Young Screenwriters. We are a resource and community for up and coming screenwriters. And today we're doing something a little different that we've not done before, which is we are breaking our first ever pilot, which is something we've been talking about, that you all have been talking about, and I'm super excited. Um, Today we're going to break down and discuss the pilot of Shadow and Bone, which is a new Netflix series. I think it just came out like last month. It's based on a trilogy of books called the Grisha trilogy. And I think I really enjoyed it. So I was excited to do it and to see what you all think. I've seen the whole season. Adam is not, right?
Yeah, I just watched the pilot, and the context of this being that decision being, we're just looking at the pilot and
Mm-hmm.
watching from getting the point of view of maybe somebody who doesn't know where things are going. We can just sort of talk about like what this does on its own feet. But that being said, I loved it, and I'm totally going to binge it this weekend. Um,
Hey.
um, yeah, I have a lot to say about fantasy in general, and this, and I also actually more than wanting to binge this, I want to read the books
Yeah.
based on this.
Although, you ready for something interesting? A big change that I read about between the books
Oh,
and the series. Apparently, our A plot and our B plot are not that connected in the books. As in, like, the thing that he's going after, that Kaz is going after, is not Alina. And that was a decision that was made for the sake of the TV series,
that makes sense.
apparently. Which I think is,
What's his objective in the book?
I can't remember. It's just something else worth a million Kruge.
Interesting.
Whatever. Yeah,
Kruge. We're saying Kruge.
a million bucks. I think that is. But yeah, I really want to read the books. But now I'm curious how that even shakes out.
It's been an embarrassing amount of time since I have like been hooked by a great fantasy series like book. Like
Yeah,
I have been super not engaged as a fantasy book reader. Um, yeah, Theo. That's exactly what it is. It's well, maybe not YA fantasy exhaustion, but like it's a real thing. If you get really into it, there's a sameness to a lot of them, and
yeah,
we can get into that later. I have some thoughts about fantasy protagonists.
yeah. I think what I really liked about this is that it did play into a lot of the tropes that you see in fantasy a lot. Like by the end of this one, it's clear we've got a chosen one going on. But I think this like pending heist element adds something new. And then this is what we titled the video, which is dynamic world building. Something that I really, really liked about this that I hadn't seen in fantasy a lot before is the fact that there's so many, like that there's characters from different backgrounds, but their backgrounds matter. Like it's not just that we have like that her background is Shu and they casted an actor that could fit that role and then just left it. Like it actually has consequences. Kaz having a cane and having a limp or that disability is going to have consequences. They have characters who are diverse, but it matters. Like it's not just blind casting, colorblind casting, and things like that. And that's one reason why I really liked this world and series.
But I also think there was a lot also going on, like in the fundamentals of like what the setup and situation is. Like, for example,
Yeah,
the context of being like the political scenario and the way different actors and agents are interacting and having conflict points, like the North and the South being blocked off politically. They have to go through the fold to get resources. Like, there are very immediate, fundamental, like, conflict points on a political and personal scale that are just interesting no matter what. And I think that accelerates the fact that there's sort of a, built-in, you know, sort of look on like sort of what it means to be like a refugee, what it means to be a member of like a different race in a culture that, has sort of, made that difficult. Like,
Yeah.
there's a, but that being said, in the context of I'm watching just the pilot, you see a lot of scenes and it's sort of like, well, they're setting up that. Yeah, okay, they got established. Is what I call it bad storytelling when it doesn't work, and I call it your expositional medicine when it does work. And in this case, it's the expositional medicine. Like the first 15 minutes of this show were, especially the first 3 minutes, were like all pure. They're trying to get you all the information they can before they can get to the good shit. Sorry, good stuff. And like the voiceover, like typically speaking, I think they get away with it because it's an adaptation of a book, and it's very clear that they're trying to get to the good stuff. There's a gray area.
That's one of the other things that I think I highlighted this, if you all get the coffee class emails, was that they break like all the exposition rules very quickly. Like we open with voiceover, we get hit with all these flashbacks, you get these types of dialogue that are literally just question answer, like, oh no, what is that? Here is the answer to the question you just asked, and which is normally a dialogue, like something you want to avoid.
It's a faux pas.
Yeah, and dialogue. And so, but I felt like it worked. Like I still really enjoyed it, and I liked it. So I guess to sort of...
You want to do your breakdown?
Right before I get into the breakdown, I want to talk about the fact that pilots are complicated because you can break down the pilot within the context of the whole season. You can break down the pilot exactly as it is, like as it's written in order, or you can analyze the story, like the subplots within the pilot. So like you have like A plot, B plot, and eventually we're going to add a C plot. You can analyze those plots as their own stories, the pilot as its own story, or the season as its own story. And what I did in this tent poll, because I think it's the most helpful for understanding, like we didn't watch the whole season, we just watched the pilot. I analyzed it within the context of the pilot. And then I did a little bit of work to break down the individual stories as well. But I'm going to go ahead and share this with you now.
And in general, when we debut the Writing the Pilot course, when we're going to have an official template for how we break down season arcs and how we're going to break down pilots. This is kind of a prototype version of how we break down pilots.
So, all right. So this is my prototype of our first pilot tentpole. And the way that I've done it here is I've made the A story blue. I've made the B story red. And then we've broken it down into a few different major events. And the act breaks are based on the A plot. Is something that's consistent. So the B plot's happening. Those breaks don't necessarily line up with the major act breaks, but we're going based on a 3-act structure. So at the very beginning, we meet our A plot protagonist, our main protagonist, Alina Starkov. She's a map maker who's facing discrimination because of her racial background, and she's arriving at the fold. I added in here that we immediately get an exposition drop as a flashback. She's at an orphanage. The fold ate her parents, and she's encouraged to be a map maker. And in this moment, we see the normal world of this A plot. It's the fold. It's this giant space that's just pure darkness that divides the map in half. And we hear someone say that one day a saint will come who can summon the sun and destroy the fold. We get another flashback where we meet her best friend, Mal. He was like this innocent kid who Alina used to have to defend, and someone told him you can't be a boy who hides. And then now we meet Mal in the present. Mal's also at this army encampment. He is later going to be the protagonist of a C plot, a third plot. But for now, he's just a member of Alina's world. We meet Mal. He's this kind of tough guy tracker. He's in a boxing match and he wins. We meet this force, or these people called Grecias. And Grishas are magical people who have the ability to control like one element, so like wind or metal or water or fire, and other people don't like them. There's two different divisions to the army, the first army and the second army. They technically work together, but they don't like each other. This is when we see Alina and Mal unite. We learn that they're best friends, quote unquote, and that they both don't like Grisha. And I'm putting this as Alina's flaw. I go into this a little bit more when I was breaking down the A plot specifically, but it's this idea that she doesn't accept Grisha and doesn't like it and is rejecting that whole side. So we find out that there's a ship that's going into the fold, an ultralight, and the last ship got like annihilated, never came back. We meet some friends and allies, get a hint that maybe Mal has a crush on Alina, we don't know. And then finally we get to the A plot setup, which is what we're calling one of those big events, like turning points. Think of it kind of as an inciting incident, but it's different. It's TV. We'll get into it a little bit more in a moment. So the setup is that we find out that Mal is selected to go into the fold. So Mal he was supposed to stay with Alina, but he's been chosen. He's going to go on a boat and go into the fold. That launches us into Act 2, because we do a break right after the A plot setup. So Act 2, now we're in the B plot. We're in a town on the other side of the fold, Ketterdam. We meet the B plot protagonist, Kaz. He's a bar owner, and we meet his colleague and someone who works for him, Jesper, who's a sharpshooter. This is their normal world. We see that someone's telling Kaz about this painting and how hard it would be to steal. And then a moment later, we see that Kaz was the one who stole it. So he's this criminal mastermind heist guy. We meet another character named Inej, who's this stealthy woman who Kaz saved from the menagerie. We don't exactly know what that means yet, but he saved her, and we know that she really believes in the saints. And the saints, again, are connected to this idea of the person who's going to come fix the fold. She shares that she learned of a job for 1,000,000 Kruge to cross the fold and get something. It's unclear what it is. And this is when we learn the B protagonist's flaw. Inej asks for Kaz's help getting a friend of hers out of the menagerie, and Kaz says no. It's a money thing. He's selfish and money driven. So now we cut back to our A plot. We see Alina facing discrimination because of her heritage. Mal steals her some food. This is kind of laying the groundwork for the fact that Mal is eventually going to be a C protagonist with his own plot. But he steals food from a Grisha. We meet Zoya, who's the secondary character. She can control the wind. She flirts with Mal. He turns her down. Again, a hint that he may be into Alina. They reconnect, and Alina and Mal discuss the fact that it was not a mistake. Mal is definitely going into the fold. Definitely screwed. This is kind of a midpoint, but it happens a little early. It's like the locking in moment. So we have every plot line, we have the setup, response, consequences, and then the following hook. So for the B plot, the setup was that Kaz learned the job. His response is he wants the job. He's shaking trees around Ketterdam to try to find a way through the fold. We learn nobody can get in there. We get this exposition drop, which is the fold keeps those Revkin bastards and their Grecian attack dogs in check. So we learn that some people are incentivized to keep the fold there. Eventually, he gets a tip that the guy who is giving the job wants a heart render, which is a specific type of Grisha who can control heart rate. But this bad dude, Pekka Rollins, knows too. And we meet Pekka Rollins, and he's awful, and he's taking over. Just a bad dude. Back at the war front, we meet, very briefly meet, we see his carriage for General Kerrigan, who is the Prince of Darkness. He's arriving at the fold. He's the only Grisha of his kind. He can control the shadows. It's a big deal that he's there. He's like the opposite of the Sun Summoner. Finally, we get to Alina's response. So the setup was that Mal is drafted in. The response is that now Alina knows that he must go, so she's going to go too. She burns maps, and then that are on maps of land that are on the other side of the fold, and then volunteers to go through the fold with Mal's caravan to map the other side. Accidentally gets all the map makers pulled into it. Oops. Now she's locked in, and she and Mal get on the ship. They say, nobody use any lights, okay? And then somebody uses a light, of course. And then now we get the consequences from her response. There's a Volcra attack. These monsters attack the ship. Alina tries to save Mal, and then there's a huge explosion of light, and somehow they're saved. And the consequences launch us into Act 3. The A-plot consequences do. So we see briefly the other side of the fold. We see this boy come running out, and he's a friggin' mess. He's a disaster. Somehow he made it to the other side. Back in Ketterdam, we see that Pekka Rollins found out that Kaz stole his heart render out from under him. That's going to suck later. Kaz manipulates his way in to see the job person and forces himself to be there. We see how he kind of manipulates people and more of what his superpower is. And then now we're getting the consequences of his response, which is the heart render interrogates the same guy we saw running out of the fold. And he says that he saw Alina. She's the sun summoner. And then back to back, we basically get the two hooks for the A-plot. The A-plot hook that's going to keep us going to the next season, or to the next episode, is Alina, the sun summoner. Then Dreesen shoots Alexie to contain the information, and we get our B hook. Kaz must find a way to get through the fold and get Alina for Dreesen by dawn. And that ends our pilot.
Hey, great job, Alexie.
Thank you.
This is, what's the reason why pilots are difficult is that they are not self-contained. And the reason there's different language, like the reason why we've used slightly different language, like, for example, setup, consequences, or setup, response, consequences, hook, is that's like the self-contained episode, like the pilot. When you're looking at your overall story of the season arc, it, just for the sake of clarity, an inciting incident is kind of your pilot. The pilot itself is the event of the inciting incident of, maybe, like, for example, the hooks could be like the purpose of the pilot is to get to the hook, and the hook is the inciting incident of the show. Alina's a sun summoner. Kaz must find his way to get through the fold for the million, whatever, Kruga. That was my interpretation. So
that's basically how a lot of pilots shake out, is they're different than other episodes. Well, all episodes tend to end in a hook because you need people to keep coming back, and it tends to have this like setup, response, consequences, hook rhythm that you fall into. But the difference is that, like, so then the pilot is like the inciting incident of the whole season.
Yes.
And there's an arc across the entire season. But unless you've planned for the season to be it, so for basically it to be a self-contained, like a movie that's just 8 hours or whatever it is.
Like Queen's Gambit, for example.
Yeah. Unless you're planning to do that, the difference between a season and a really long movie is the character arc. I know that Hannah talked about this if you were at one of our earlier coffee classes, but instead of being an arc, in TV, characters go through basically what's a gradual slope where they're kind of sloping towards change slowly over time. And for that reason, whenever we get to the season finale, whatever it is, there's not going to be a final fight, because the final fight is when the protagonist is showing that they've changed. It's a whole different beast, which is why we're using different terminology.
Like, for example, the ultimate test, the ultimate test is the language around that implies that it's the protagonist reaching the ultimate moment where they have to change, where they can't go any farther. And if you have a 5-season TV show and you have that moment in season 1, it doesn't really make sense the same way when you would talk about a concrete like movie where everything is self-contained and the full emotional journey.
For sure. Something that pilots and TV or pilots and movies do have in common is this idea that the protagonist is the one who's making choices.
Yes.
And something like that, it was handled very clearly when Alina burned the maps. So first off, that was her in a movie, her inciting incident would have been that Mal is drafted. Her response would be that she burns the maps, and then the call to action is that she gets chosen to go into the fold.
I think you could argue that that's the same beat, though.
It could,
because it happens right after.
Yeah, you're probably right. But anyway, yeah, I think you're right. The point I'm trying to make, though, is just that there was that moment where it wasn't just that she burned the maps. She burned the maps and then showed up and said, "Hey, I'll go." Like, it was very much that she's active.
Like, that was where she crossed a barrier that there's no point coming back from that. Like, you're burning the maps for this huge exposition for this, military. There's going to be consequences for that, and she embraced that. And the protagonist is the person who does things with consequences. They're the catalyst of change. Just to answer some questions, I totally also had trouble initially getting all the jargon and language. Like, for me, it was sort of like, every time it was Grisha, it was like, oh yeah, magic guy. If don't be hard on yourself when you have to deal with fantasy nonsense, because I'll just preface this. I'm a huge fan of fantasy in general, but for me, the fantasy nonsense test in like my first trying out of a new series, can I deal with in the land of Gintalaku, there were the people who did this, like, if it sounds too stupid for me to deal with the lingo, if I can't buy into it, I won't continue with it. For this wasn't that bad, because I always felt like, the elements were all, the choices of like the magic stuff were all active, like stake stuff. Like, the fact that the fold was dominating the political scenario gave me personally something to grab onto, and I could handle the names. Terminology.
And honestly, like, when I watched the pilot, I feel like because I've watched the whole season, I have more understanding of like who these characters are and who matters, so that helps. So knowing that General Kerrigan, even though we don't meet him, is someone that is of note, which is kind of like implied. I did pick up
that his power, let me guess, is his power that he can create darkness?
Yeah.
Okay. That is great. Because that was that line about the person who created the fold was like a magic type like him. Gotcha. Fighting fire with more fire. Can we talk for a minute about like the dialogue in this? So dialogue is, in storytelling, super intentional and representative of the elements of story. Like, the dialogue isn't how people speak. It's like a crystallized version of story. And there was a line, I don't know what her character arc is going to look like overall in the series, but the line, "Keep a pencil in your hand or someone will put a rifle in it instead," sounds like a flaw. Like, the reason she chose to become a cartographer instead of a soldier, because it was a mechanism of protecting herself from the world that would seek to, kill her because of her race and background. Like, I can totally see that, like, her choosing to become maybe a sun summoner or maybe a soldier in some sense is like an arc. Is that accurate?
I think you're on something.
I'm onto something, but I'm not, because I haven't seen the rest of the season. I don't have full clarity there.
Yeah. It's like, honestly, that's something where I wish that her flaw was stronger, and I think it's stronger in the books.
Right.
In the books, I feel like I'm okay saying these things because it's like leading up to the inciting incident, like this moment at the end of the pilot. So I'm not revealing anything before, or anything after. But in the books, apparently she is repressing this magic her whole life. And it makes her kind of sick and weakly. And then then like letting it out is something that's going to like help her, and she has to do that over time. I didn't see that in this pilot. She seemed perfectly fine.
Sorry, Dilla's comment made me laugh.
Yes.
Honestly, this is the fantasy test.
Yeah.
One of the biggest, one of the, I'm going to talk about it. I'm sorry. The smartest or most the ballsiest thing Lord of the Rings did is it opened on a dissertation on like the life and dissertation on like pipeweed of the hobbits and like the different genealogies and like the different families at different times and where they lived and all this boring information dump that has nothing to do with the elements of story in any way. But what it does is it gives you like a sense of, oh shit, this is a real place. These fucking hobbits. God.
Man.
But like so much of that problem with terminology and fantasy is this overriding sense that that's just some name you made up for a silly thing. Like so much of like, I drew a map and this is in Galadu and this is the river of Kupa and that's my world. Like that's the level of thought that goes into a lot of these fantasy worlds. And like unless you like really work on like making it real and tangible for like the audience really early on, giving a sense of historiosity, giving a sense of verisimilitude to some of my $10 words for the day. Like that's the challenge I think with fantasy is like that sense of, no, this is real. And I think one of the ways fantasy has been trying to get past that hurdle has been to get personal really fast.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, this is a human being. This is their problems.
I'd say that, and they steal from history. Like how Game of Thrones was the War of the Roses. And this is very much like a Russian inspired world. Like a lot of the culture and the language and stuff like that is inspired by like Russian history. Right. And so in fantasy does that a lot, where they're pulling from history and then building on it. And that gives it a type of believability and credibility that I think helps.
For me, two things. Sorry, what were you saying?
I say, wasn't Lord of the Rings based on something and then he denied it?
No, it wasn't based. It was based on a lot of things, and he was open about it. He said it was based. He first of all, Tolkien was a professor of like myth and like Norse mythology and Beowulf. Like he was obsessed with fairy tales and stuff, and like he intentionally tried. The Lord of the Rings was written as an attempt to make a mythology for Anglo-Saxon Britain because it was lost when the Normans invaded. All of the Saxon stories, all the stories from England were lost because they weren't written down. So it was his sort of wish fulfillment of like, I wish those stories existed. So I'm going to try and write a fake version of the history of England, like a fantasy mythology version that doesn't really make sense if you look at it. But like that was, and he was drawing on Norse mythology and drawing on like, like he didn't invent like dwarves or elves. He just sort of changed it intentionally. It's like, it's interesting if you get into it.
So here's a question from Michelle real quick.
Sorry.
Sometimes with fantasy, it gets really confusing memorizing all the names and places or new concepts. How would you suggest writers balance exposition and the showing of the new world, especially for TV? So, a few quick points. It is going to be very hard to sell a fantasy script like this type of fantasy, like heavy world building and things like that, if it's not based on a book or a comic or something else. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's very hard to do because it kind of, it's just, you need the space of a book to flesh it all out almost, like if you're going to be building this world. And it's
also about like marketability.
Yeah.
If you're going to put $100 million to flesh out a fantasy world, it better be something that has a built-in fan base that'll show up.
No, for sure. But when you're rolling with but in this one, I think that the way that it was handled, to me, works because of a lot of the things that people are criticizing it over, frankly. I think you
What are
had
people criticizing it over?
like the dialogue, like kind of feeling like stilted and things like that. I think it's that it's like it's your
more than the
exposition.
pilot? Is it because like is it just for the pilot people are talking about? Because it was very much like I could tell they're just trying to tell us
that's
what's happening.
I wasn't annoyed by the dialogue later. I thought the dialogue was good, but maybe I was forgiving because I was enjoying what was happening.
Right.
I don't know. But I felt like in this case, they did what you're saying, like where they're saying like they had to give us the information. And so they chose to do that instead of like drawing this out into like 3 episodes where we like learn about things really like naturally and get bored with the lack of action. They just said it in a lot of cases. Like people just came to Kaz and said, hey, there's a guy who is going to give $1 million if you do this job. Yeah. And then they were like, okay, cool. Now they're going to roll with it. And there was a lot of like question answer type stuff happening with Mal and Alina, and like, when did you get here? Last week. What about you? Just kind of setting it up quickly.
I think in my personal experience of the pilot, I just watched it. I was hooked the moment Alexie was running out of the fold. After that was the moment where like in terms of like the moment where they find with his confession and they find out what really happened. That was the moment where I was like, oh, actually some interesting things are going to happen, because like we start to play with information. We start to see where things are going. My first fear was that they were going to spend too much time in the fold or something. Like I liked that. Did Alexie have to get killed? Yes. I don't know, but that's the decision they made. I didn't watch the rest of it. So.
I say yes because, I mean, it was exactly what
it made sense that they wouldn't. The information would have been value. Exactly. Like it wouldn't have made sense for them to let him go. Yeah, for sure. Definitely made sense.
If that's the kind of guy you are. Like if he wants $1 million to get the Sun Summoner for whatever reason, he does not gonna want a bunch of other people to know that the Sun Summoner is running around.
Right.
Because it makes it more difficult for him to get her for whatever reason.
So just to talk about, overall, pilot structure, you got to think of your pilot as being the inciting incident of your show, but also showing the new world of your show, like the hook. Like, remember that's why I think why Act 3 was the most interesting for me, because that was actually kind of, for me, the taste of what the show was going to be. Like, setup is boring. But like the moment where you actually start to see like action, like in terms of not just an action, like things blowing up and people dying, but like, oh, the characters are actually pursuing things, and I get a taste of what this is going to be like. She's going to be pursued by these different political groups. There are stakes involved. There's money involved. There's criminal organizations. There's the war involved. Like the moment I got to see, you can tell me all about the individual pieces. But the moment I start to see them intersect, that's the new world of this particular show. The new world of, say, Breaking Bad, which they always talk about, is the moment he starts to actually cook meth with Jesse, and it starts to go wrong. That is the promise, the hook of the show. It's so many pilots have fallen into the trap of being like very clever, self-contained stories that don't show the new world and promise of what the show is going to be. So no matter what your show is, no matter what your pilot is, you want to think about, how is this setting everything up where we get a sense of, this is art where it's an art, not a science. How do we set up who the characters are and why we should care about them? An inciting incident that catalyzes and starts the plot of the whole show and teases out what the fun of this whole show is going to be. Because if every episode is after the inciting incident is going to be in the new world fun, that's kind of the aspiration. And one of the reasons a lot of pilots are kind of boring. I as a rule, I never judge a show based on the pilot, because most of the time they're great shows that I hate the pilots for. It's because the pilot is almost like, oh, I got to take my medicine of setup before I can get to the good shit. And you want the good shit. So I'm swearing a lot. We could demonetize us.
So yes, Nicole. So should the pilot be the inciting incident of the season arc as well as contain an inciting incident within the episode? Yes.
Yes. So that's why we use the word setup. So
Yeah.
like the setup is what we're calling the mini inciting incident in this episode. And the setup in this episode for the A plot is that Mal is selected to go into the fold.
So that is like the equivalent to the in a feature, the like inciting incident call to action moment. Like that's the moment that's going to propel us into the story. And here, yeah, we call it the setup. And then if you look at the whole season as a sort of feature film adjacent beast, then yes, the pilot is the inciting incident. It should have the event that's going to shove us forward. And you see that with like everything. You see that, I mean, I keep thinking of Friday Night Lights, but in the first episode of Friday Night Lights, the football player, what's his name? Jason?
I've never seen it.
I don't know. But he gets injured. He gets paralyzed in that first season, and now they're going to need a new star quarterback. So it's like, if you look at pilots, it's always that thing. It's always that. It's always that in that pilot episode, they get the inciting incident that's going to drive the season forward. Jason Street. Yes.
Hey, thanks, people.
Clear eyes. Full hearts. I was going to say Overstreet. I was
also,
like,
Michelle, that's actually a great observation. I think it's a huge struggle for hard world building to work in movies. I think that Lord of the Rings is the exception, not the rule. And that's because they're 3 hours long. And that's not something you can eat. It's like an aberration. It's not how movies are made, typically.
Especially now that trilogies are such a thing. Like,
right.
Because it tricks you into believing that should be the format for a movie. When it's a trilogy, it's like, oh, we can make 3 movies. It's like, should you? I feel like as much as I have issue now with Harry Potter, it's like, if that was written in modern times, I feel like it would have been. It'd be a TV show, but also I feel like it worked because it wasn't like a trilogy. Like, there's a version of Harry Potter that would have just been a trilogy instead of 7 books, and then it would have been, it's like, yeah. But I think
that is very good, Samantha. That's exactly that's exactly my read of the Game of Thrones pilot.
Yep.
And once you see this, you can't unsee it. It's like one of those things,
Yeah.
If you think about like the normal world is just the beginning of the pilot, and the new world is the rest of the show. It's like the reason why somebody watches a show. The new world of Breaking Bad is, like I said, high school teacher cooking meth with his old student and shit happening. Like that's the reason why people watch the show, and pretty much every episode does that.
So Adam, take a guess at what you think the new world's going to be.
It's going to be her exploring her sun summoner powers while government criminal underworld looks for her.
Pretty good.
Right?
Pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Good.
And I mean, and
I would be betrayed if that wasn't the case, because for me, that was like established in the pilot. And if they go for a different new world, that would be like kind of a promise broken to the audience.
Yeah. And I mean, they set up a lot of really cool things, like where they're saying that, like, they said things like that there's people in the north, I think, like at the orphanage, the lady was like, there's people in the north who want to kill our Grisha. And then we know that the first army, the normal people, like Mal and Alina previously, don't like Grisha. And that Grisha have this like really contentious relationship with other people, and that her identity is gonna be like wrecked because she's identified as a normal person who doesn't like these people who are kind of like they're in like brightly colored clothes while everyone else is like in this like
Right.
drab stuff. It's like suddenly learning that you're part of the elite. And so she's going to get wrenched out of this world is just what it tends to mean. And yeah, I'd be curious if you all.
Do you think the fold is a metaphor for the Berlin Wall?
Oh, maybe. I read from the author was that she was saying that I feel like that would almost be a more interesting take. What the author said was that in so much fantasy, there's like metaphors for darkness. And what if darkness wasn't a metaphor? Like, what if it was a place? And I think that's an interesting
that's
thought. But
yeah.
But I would have liked it. But I hope it has a mother meaning.
So the way I view this concept as somebody who knows a lot of fantasy but doesn't know what these books are like, for me, the appeal of this, the way I see it, is in your cake of I'm going to use a horrible metaphor. For the cake of the show, the cake metaphor, the base layer of the cake is the chosen one, typical fantasy of girl realizing her powers that change the world, and she's so important, everybody's after her. And the frosting is like the complicated political situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the good stuff.
I will say I was kind of surprised by the direction that this one went.
Oh, I'm sure there are lots of ways you can go with it. Like I think there's some really cool chosen one narratives out there, actually. Like I'm not against chosen one narratives. I'm against them when they're done badly. I'm going to share this great tweet I saw somewhere. It's on fantasy heroes. So I forget who said it. I should attribute it, but basically she said there are only 3 types of fantasy heroes. The chosen one, the oh fuck, why me? And the shit, somebody's got to fix this. Those are the 3 types of fantasy protagonists. I think that rings pretty true. Like if Harry Potter / this one are chosen one narratives, and like the character who inside of them they have alone are the person who needs to say, literally Harry was called the chosen one in book 5 or whatever, right?
But he's also very much a why me the whole time.
He's whining but in terms of like his core motivation, like he is the only one who can solve it. But like Frodo in Lord of the Rings is the definition of a why me. Oh shit, like it's just a bad luck person, wrong place, wrong time, and the shit somebody's got to fix this is typically an anti-hero. I think like Geralt in The Witcher. Like he doesn't have to save things, but he's kind of like, oh crap. If nobody else is going to do it, I might as well. Yeah.
Which is hard because you have to, because that's actually a difficulty sometimes that you run into with writing is like you need to be able to answer the question of like, why must they respond to this? And if you're not going to give them a plot, like a big,
especially to be heroic, right? Like like a hero is different than just a protagonist. Like the hero is in a fantasy context, especially, is like the person who like saves the world or whatever, Yeah,
it's like the why me is like when the plot is forcing them to act, and when someone's got to fix this is when their character is forcing them to act, and so like it's kind of like which of those things is driving them forward. And in order to make it work where it's their character that's forcing them to act, you got to be like really clear on who they are and what they want and like what drives them to action in general.
So going back to this pilot, and just talking about like when you're thinking about your pilots and why you're writing something, the assumption is that you're probably not writing a fantasy pilot, right? But still, you got to think about like what is the frosting, and what's like the base of the cake? Like what is it about your idea that's fundamentally making it work? And then like what's like the interesting thing that's like going to make people lean forward in their chairs when you pitch? Because if you don't have, I think that's the number one thing that's wrong with I'm reading this book by that's a compilation of essays by Hayao Miyazaki, and he had great metaphor he used, it's similar to my cake metaphor, for how he chooses story ideas, and like why he like has rejected every script that's ever been presented to him. Because he said, my dream is that somebody gives me a finished script and it's perfect, and then we can just do it. He says, but that's never the case, because the best story is like a Christmas tree, and you need your trunk. It needs to be solid conceptually, and you need the branches that make it interesting, the characters, the things that I, as the animator, can place ornaments on. So for him, his idea as a director, the person who executes, you want something that you can hang ornaments on, that you can make special. And a great screenplay, in this metaphor, is the Christmas tree. And he was whining very loudly in the essay about, God damn it, I only get trunks and twigs. Like, I've never get a Christmas tree. No, he said he had never in his entire career ever been presented with an idea that was a trunk and the thing. And he said, like, for him, he was like, oh, why me? Well, I guess I've got to do it. Right. It's kind of interesting.
What's the book, Adam?
Oh, Starting Point. I have to say, it's one of the best books on storytelling and like animation. If you're interested in animation, you kind of have to read it. It's like everything you'd expect it to be. And he actually goes into detail. He goes into detail about like why he's listed as a screenwriter, how he writes his storyboards, the problems he has, like his conceptual vision of like why American animation is the way it is and why anime is the way it is, and like his whole dissection of like, it's really interesting. And not for this conversation, but Starting Point is a really good book.
If you are subscribed to our newsletter, it's going out tomorrow. And that was Adam's book recommendation for the month. So I have a link in there that's going out. I did not recommend a book. I always feel dumb next to Adam and John's recommendations. John's always reading some like big nonfiction thing, and Adam's reading something. And I added in video games this time.
To be fair, I have been falling into the trap of like reading half of a book. And then like this, I've given myself permission to, the moment I'm not interested, to say it's okay to put it away. Like my time is valuable. You know, if I'm not interested in something, I don't have to finish it. That might just be laziness.
I like this point. Theo says, I think my issue with a lot of YA brand fantasy is that the protagonists aren't flawed enough because they still carry a bit of self-insert, in my opinion. And then we got, let's see. Michelle agreed, saying, yeah, they can be a little self-insert, chosen one, love triangles, etc. I think, and then this point too, I think that's also why YA is popular, because readers will see themselves as the protagonist. Yeah, I think it's part of that. It's like what do young people want? Like what are young people looking for in particular?
Young people are looking for wish fulfillment. They're looking, not to talk about that book again, but Hayao Miyazaki said that anime, one of the reasons it appeals to young people is the fantasy fulfillment of nostalgia for a lost world, to be like in a place and to like live a life of romance and daring. Like it's really that self-insertion into like, and that's kind of appeal of young adult fantasy too.
Well, and that's, I mean, I've talked about this a little bit. Again, it was Meg Lafave wrote Inside Out. Sorry. Yeah. But she talks about the difference between coming of age stories and other stories, and defines it by saying that like in other stories, protagonists have a flaw that they're going to fix. In coming of age stories, they are basically starting off as like an unformed blob and then become who they're going to be by the end. And like, I would still technically consider that a flaw and an inner need. I would just define it more specifically, like what part of them needs to be defined. But I think that that's really interesting because that fits with what you all are saying about YA books, where it's like, when it's a coming of age story, it's not necessarily that this kid or this young person is wrong. They're not necessarily flawed. They just don't know who they are yet. And then over the course of the story, they're coming into the person that they're going to be. And I think that that's pretty relatable to a lot of kids. Because, I mean, you might have flaws, but you're still a kid. You don't know what you're going to do. Like, it tends to be like fairly unusual for you to know exactly who you are at a young age. And so it's more relatable to be seeing someone else struggle with who they want to be. not have issue with who they already are. And then
Hayao Miyazaki did say that anime was a mistake, but I think he goes into more detail in the book. If you read it, he talks about how he thinks it's more of like a missed opportunity because he sees anime, modern anime, as more just like an interpolation of manga with like the paneling, the rhythm of the paneling expressions of manga, like static expressions with low frame rates due to like limited time and money. And he says the missed opportunity is that you have character designs that are based for single note expressions with static backgrounds that don't focus on movement. And he thinks the highest aspiration of animation is to show emotion through active and real-time movement. And you notice if you watch a Miyazaki film, he doesn't do those like anime expressionist stop moments where the background's frozen and the character is just doing a repeating like static like expression, which is more like how a joke would work in a manga. He believes that animation should instead aspire to show movement in its entirety and show like the observation of real people expressing themselves to show emotion, which admittedly takes time and money that animation small studios of underpaid animators don't have time for. And also, you know, the culture likes what anime is, so people like it. Why would you change the formula? So it's very interesting. I'd highly recommend the book. I am plugging it.
Samantha says, does all fantasy have to be set in complex other worlds different than reality? Thinking of Big Fish and most Tim Burton and how the worlds are visually different, but not necessarily otherworldly. No, they don't. And I think, you know, you get that sometimes. Like it's just like one piece that shifted. I'm trying to think of examples. I've not seen Big Fish. I've heard that I should.
It's a great movie, from what I remember, but
yeah. Adam is getting a percentage of sales from the book.
I also don't want to like say that I'm like, you know, think Miyazaki's perfect or whatever. I do think he's like a really interesting artist with a great point of view on certain things. Don't agree with everything he says.
This is interesting. Theo says it's been interesting to watch how millennial readership is really stuck with YA. I think that has to do something with our culture and like the internet and like
it's the infantilization of adults. And it's something Hollywood has been doing for 40 years. I think Steven Spielberg does it too. You know, it's the nostalgia machine create like the joy of being a child and discovering things for the first time. Like that emotional core is like the fuel of YA, the self-insert young person coming into their own and having a life adventure, having young love, having young like you know, finding who you are. Like that is kind of been fed as like this huge like opiate, I think, to adults, and we like it's such a pleasure to experience, and you don't have to think that much, that we just sort of mainline the stuff. Not say it's anything wrong with it, but it's a thing.
I think it might be that, and I think it's maybe a combination of like having our lives have to be like a lot of millennials. I think you and me are on like the youngest side of millennials that you can be and still be a millennial. But a lot of millennials who are older had their lives much more delayed than I did by the recession, and like had a lot of things sort of pause. And I think the internet, millennials and the internet was a big thing, like where it's helping to figure out who you are. And there's like more choices for who you can be with the internet. And I think that maybe that's part of it. But I don't know. I'm making something up right now.
No. I mean, that's a totally valid aspect of this. I mean, like, I think the real answer is a complicated combination of a lot of things. I do think, though, that there is a deep desire to be a child again in a lot of people. And I think it's one of the biggest reasons Marvel movies are as popular as they are, you know, and other things aren't, you know, like stories that have ambiguous, difficult questions are not as popular fundamentally because, you know, it's uncomfortable. Ambiguity fundamentally is uncomfortable, especially for American millennials. And I think for millennial and just young people across the world, you know, I think it's not everybody. I just think overall general trends, lowest common denominator, there's definitely a pull away from ambiguity and a pull towards full circle stories that give you all the juice you need. And first of all, I'm as guilty of pursuing that as much as anybody. So
there's trends as cultures too. Like, I haven't studied it as much as I would like to, but I know I've brought this up before, that even like in like ancient civilizations, there's a history that shows that when your culture is threatened by like if when your culture is having an existential crisis for some reason, you get a lot more storytelling around apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic worlds. And which is kind of interesting when you look at the fact that we had like a huge explosion of apocalyptic YA novels before. And I think that you also get this thing where it's escapism. And escapism, you only need escapism when reality is difficult, and we're kind of in tumultuous times. But also I think that, again, like the internet just allows you to realize how tumultuous all times are in a way. So it's like we now are being like, we're now more exposed to stresses, and so escapism becomes more enticing. And I think that might be part of it.
I don't think there's anything wrong with escapism, though. It's just about balance. That's my only problem, is like when you get to the point where you don't have any stories that are like popular that deal with ambiguity, I feel like that's a problem. Like, and it's about balance. What would you say?
What's this example of a story that you would say does deal with ambiguity? I'm trying to think of what you mean.
I mean, ambiguity, I think maybe a better word is more sort of like duality, maybe like sort of, I think The Godfather is a very popular example.
What about Promising Young Woman?
Promising Young Woman definitely engages with, it definitely deals with difficult issue, and it has a difficult answer. I think the most interesting thing about it, which I don't necessarily agree with, because the one of my note when I gave initially was that it was a martyr thing, the saying, oh, you have to be a martyr to advance the cause. But that would mean that that's a more interesting answer than if it was escapism. And it's not escapism, you know, like it's not escapism. It's not exploiting the subject in necessarily. I mean, it is a little bit, but I would say that is a film that has duality, because it's sort of, it's talking about something uncomfortable, taking multiple views at it. The Godfather was an example too, where, you know, you are seeing the other side of something that's kind of disgusting and horrible. And you're seeing somebody being, you know, somebody who's a war hero, yada, 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 devolve into his father. Like, there's a lot of it. When I mean by ambiguity, I mean like there's no clear answer.
I want to pull up this from Michelle. I wonder if the reason why Apocalypse is so popular is a bit of compartmentalization. Is it because it compartmentalizes those fears, like how murder podcasts are popular with women? And I think absolutely. And I think that it's also like, there's almost like it, I'm going to get a little bit into psychology, but like when you're dealing with trauma, there's almost like this, self-triggering compulsion that lets you feel in control by seeking things that are kind of like tapping into trauma or like deeper fears. And I think that that might be part of what's going on with that. It's interesting. I really like studying why certain stories are popular and when, and it kind of gets to this thing that people kind of call like the like story, like subconscious, like tapping into like the collective subconscious or something, like where a thing that kept happening to me was I kept writing stories like a month too late or something. Like we'd go out with my story and we'd be like, oh no, something's in development now that's exactly on that topic. And it happened over and over and over again, to the point like where you're like, you know what, there must have been a reason why, like I must have been picking up the same vibes that somebody else was picking up that led me to thinking that this was a good idea. And it's cool how culture kind of moves in that way, and then certain stories emerge. But I'm getting you away from Shadow and Bone by quite a bit.
Well, one thing I think about Apocalypse YA also fundamentally plays into childhood fantasy, right? Like in Arrested Development, it's like when the world is over, you can delay being an adult in the system.
Yeah, it's true.
But getting back to the show, I thought it was great. I'm definitely going to watch the rest of it. You know, the most interesting thing for me was like the intersection of like political conflict with, you know, the magic stuff. I think,
Yeah.
you know, her character didn't really get a chance to shine in the pilot episode because it was all set up. And the most interesting thing was the scene was you know, when the Velka attacked or whatever. And she didn't say anything. So I think in future episodes, we're going to go deeper into her character and seeing her do stuff.
Yeah. Gonna see her do more things, hopefully. Yeah, I think, and Dilla brought up a really interesting point that the thing that hooked him was the moment when we saw Inej react to the fact that there was going to be a sun summoner with so much reverence. It's like, oh, okay. There's like, I think it's kind of similar to what you were saying, Adam, like, where it's like, okay, this is a world where there's been like thought put into the politics and the religion, and like where it's going to have like complicated relationships that are more nuanced. It's not just, oh, there's this person who can shoot sun rays. That's nice. Let's go tear down the thing.
Can I mention something? I think I'm looking forward to talking about more TV for one fundamental reason, which is TV is more interesting. It's more complicated. There are a lot of more systems and characters in place. There are a lot of intersections. There's a lot of tension and ambiguity. There's a lot of opportunity for conflict. The big takeaway is that movies are simple, fundamentally. Movies are simple stories. Movies are like, basically, a movie is a pilot and a half. You know, like, yeah. Now, not to say that movies are easy to write. They're very hard to write in their own way. But it's a simple. It takes a simple story to have a beginning, middle, and end in 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
That's the game. And I think just recognizing that when you're deciding, ooh, is this a TV show or is this a movie? Fundamentally, the answer, if you go and come up in the movie camp, is this a self-contained simple story I can tell in one sitting?
Yeah. So I think I have a thought for this. What is the most important thing to keep in the back of your mind when world building? Any tips? I would say really, really, my advice is to really lean into cause and effect. So you're not just coming up with random things. So like, say you started with this idea of the fold. Think about cause and effect. What caused it? What are the effects? And like when you look at the effects, it's like, okay, well, if this is like, it's going to be killing a bunch of people. What are the effects of that? People are going to fear it. What are the effects of that? Like it's going to, like also thinking about the fact that it's dividing the map. That's an effect. How does that affect politics? It's like, well, it keeps these two worlds completely separate. Like, and then just building everything out from there, and like how it creates this religion around it, it's like mythology, and everything is sort of traced back to this, in this web, goes back to the starting point of, in this case, I think it was the fold, based on what she said about how that was what started the idea, is you start with that at the center of the web and you build it out. And it's your job as the writer to think about like, okay, what are the political consequences? What are the social consequences? And what do those mean? What does that mean? And like keep building it out, but have it all be connected back to this first idea that you had. That way it's not just like, I want to do something in the future. There's flying cars and there's personalized medicine. And now people can communicate with their minds and like all these like random things. You don't want it to be and then and then and then. It's always like therefore, therefore, like what we talk about.
Something I want to add on is if you're interested in world building, you should definitely check out Brandon Sanderson's 3 Laws of Magic Creation. Not that video, that video as well. Brandon Sanderson's great. Love or hate his writing. He's very good at articulating this stuff, but his 3 rules of magic creation actually carry on to like world building in general. The first rule is the author's abilities to solve conflict in a satisfying way with magic is directly proportional to how the reader understands the magic. So if you can show that the protagonist can flip coins with their mind, they cannot solve any problem in the story unless it's with flipping coins with their mind. And like really focusing in on like, okay, like if you're telling a story, what are the things the character can do, and how can I like limit that and then expand that with their proficiency? So it's like basically don't pull things out of thin air. Like if you want to make a magic system or something that works and is real, like explain it simply and then like draw it out simply. And the second thing is limitations and weaknesses. For example, what is it about this magic system that they can't do? Does when you use your powers, does your eyeball fall off? Like the fold, how is it like limiting the political section? The most interesting thing about this world is that it's fragmented by this magical barrier, and like things are built around it. I would check that out. Like I don't want to just list it all. That's it right there.
It's like as important as it is for you to understand that like some people can, like, when they went into the fold, it's like, yeah, this woman can throw fire from her hands, but it's not enough to kill all the Volcra. Like, what are the limits of it? And I think limitations is one of the biggest things too, is like, where is the edge of your world? Like, where are the edges of the maps and like the edges of the powers, and what doesn't it touch is really important, I think.
One of the best weaknesses and limitations I've ever seen in a magic system is in Wheel of Time. And just think about this for a second. For every time a man uses magic, they go a little bit more insane until the point where they'll lose all their sanity and kill everybody they love. Now that's fun. And the protagonist in the story is magic sensitive. And the more he uses it, the more he hears that voice in his head telling him to do things. And you actually see that play out in the books. The voice gets louder and starts telling him things. And it's like, wow, that's dramatic. That's a limitation. That's a weakness. I'm really curious to hear how that's going to be Amazon's next big fantasy series. So I'm really going to. Isn't
that like $1 billion, or is that something else?
No, that's Lord of the Rings, unfortunately.
Okay.
I really don't want that series.
$1 billion budget.
And here's the crazy thing: it's not actually Lord of the Rings. It's just because Lord of the Rings is just a story in Middle Earth. That's a specific book series. It's totally made up prequel. It has nothing to do with the books.
For $1 billion.
For $1 billion.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of money. You could have like 20. You could have 20. Listen, I love Tolkien as much as the next guy, but like, A, that's not a source material. But B, you could fund like 100 shows from like interesting perspectives, people, like stories that should be told in the world. Like, I mean, come on. Like, also, we had the movies. We don't need more. Come on.
Also, I feel like you could do it for a smaller budget. Like, do you need that? I don't know.
I think Wheel of Time should get $1 billion because that's 14 books. That's a lot of material. 14 900-page books.
Maybe $1 billion over the course of 14 seasons, but like, jeez.
Yeah. Another thing about world building, I think, to think about is like when you like come up with a rule, like, oh, I want a floating city in the clouds. Think about like how that would actually work. Like, where are the bathrooms? Like, how do they get supplies? Where does that, like, ask yourself logical questions about like, well, how would that actually work? What would happen if that happened? Like, and like, just follow the line of logic, being like, okay, people can, make magic explosion or like, whatever. Like, how would that actually work, and what would actually happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then,
where are the bathrooms? That's my big contribution to this world building conversation.
It's true. And I think it's like, and the more popular your stuff gets, the more you're going to have fans asking those questions. So you might as well have your answers now.
Mortal Engines. Yeah. I did not like the movie. I thought it was not very good. It's this young adult fantasy series about moving cities. And it was produced by Peter Jackson, directed by his storyboard artist of a lot of years. And it starred, I think, Dakota Johnson, somebody like that.
Johnson?
Yeah, what's her name?
Really?
Yeah, somebody like that. Let me look.
That's like 50 Shades of Grey, Dakota Johnson, right?
I mean, sorry, I'm going to have to check this before I'm probably wrong. It probably wasn't her.
Dakota Fanning?
No, it was this other white girl. It was this other white girl who looks the same.
Wait, Anna Sophia Robb?
No, Hera something. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I was wrong. All these young white brunettes, they look the same to me, you know.
There you go.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Whoever it was.
It definitely wasn't her. I was wrong. I'm sorry.
You know, same thing. It happens. South Dakota. Yep.
Yeah, Peter should have directed it. But the problem is he's like one step away from like a heart attack from just all the stress of directing movies. So he probably should stick around with editing documentaries, which is what he does now. His World War I documentary was actually amazing. I would highly recommend it. What they did is they took old photos from like decrepit photographs, and they they revitalized them in 4K color, and it totally recontextualizes how you saw that time.
I love
it's amazing.
I follow people on Twitter who do that for a job, like who colorize old photos, and it's really cool. Yeah.
Oh, video footage. It was video footage, actually. They actually made it look like it was shot today, even if it was like shot in like World War I.
Oh, Jesus. That's insane.
And it was actually kind of a little bit of a mind fuck, because it made what you saw is like all these young like English kids, and they were like, oh my God, those are like real people. Like there's something about like the old technology that like creates like a veneer of like separation, and to like see it in like 4K color kind of makes it a little bit more like, oh, closer to home. It was very interesting. Depressing movie, obviously, because it's about all these young men who got killed for no reason.
Yeah. So we are coming up on the end of today.
Oh, yes, we are.
So I want to tell you all about what's happening this month, because I'm very excited about it. Next Friday, we are doing The Mitchells versus the Machines, which is a new movie on Netflix by Lord and Miller, who did like the Lego movie and I think Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. It's produced by them, and I've just heard really, really great things. It's going to be super fun, and we're inviting this guy who I think you're going to really like. His name is Connor. He was a student of John's with me, and we did an independent study together. We just sat in John's office for like an hour every single week and wrote together with me, him, and John. And it was the best, and he's really great. And he's into animation, so he's going to come join us to help break down that movie. And then the next week, week 3, we are doing Pitch Week again. So Pitch Week is back, and we have 3 people coming in to pitch projects. The thing that unites the projects is they're all protagonists with passion projects. So we'll see how that goes. They're going to be pitching to John, so keep them in your thoughts and prayers, and it's going to be very fun. I think actually Jocelyn's going to come back to watch. I don't know if she's going to be on the show or in the audience, but Jocelyn wants to come check it out. And then finally, something I'm super, super, super excited about is we have a guest coming the last Friday of the month, Clara Fernandez Vara, who is going to talk to us about writing for video games. So Clara teaches narrative game design at the NYU Game Center. And I talked with her for a while, and she's super great and super passionate. She's like a games scholar and a games creator. She's going to talk about writing for video games and how it's different than screenwriting, how it's similar, how you can do it, what it's like, what goes into making games, just anything you could ever want to know about writing for video games. So make sure to check that out. That's going to be a ton of fun. And if you have any questions you want to be sure that I ask her, come join us in Discord and let me know in the coffee class chat, and I will write them down. Not that we can't take your questions in the moment, but I can work them into the first interview. It's going to be super fun. I'm very excited for this month. And then we already are planning great stuff for next month too. So
fantastic. I am all for it.
We're trying to do some more different stuff in coffee class. So pilots and more guests, and we're going to try to do a monthly pitch week, trying to change it up to make sure it's as fun as possible. So I'm excited.
And on that note, let's log off. All right, everybody.
Okay, everybody. We'll see you in the Discord, and next week when we do the Mitchells versus the Machines. Bye.
All right. Adios.